I've been using the OnePlus Nord for 4 months now, so I thought I'd do a video saying what I think about it 4 months later, and whether I'd still recommend it with all of the new phones that have come out since then. So starting off with the design, I do still really like the screen. Yes, there are a lot of cheaper phones now that do have a full screen display. Even with that, there are some things that are unique to this phone as opposed to other phones. So yes, it does have a 1080p display, which I personally think is more than good enough. But the kind of big thing that I really like about this phone is the fact that they decided to go with a 90Hz display for it. For me, that makes a really big difference. Even just going from 60 to 90, I mean, going to 120 would be an even bigger difference. And as is the case with consoles, where I'd prefer to play games in 1080p at 120 versus 4K at 60. I think frame rate is so much more important than resolution, or at least a lot more noticeable for the average consumer. So yeah, I'm really happy that they went with that. It makes the phone feel smoother and a lot less jittery as compared to 60Hz displays. And they also went with AMOLED too, which I really like. That's not a new technology, but at this price point, it is pretty nice to see that in here. I also still really like the colour of the phone. I like the cyan back that's on it. I usually add skins to phones, but in terms of this phone, I just didn't want to. I just don't want to cover up the back because I do really like it. But in terms of durability, there's no scratches or anything on the back of it. The plastic frame has actually held up really well. That is something that I was a bit worried about when I first got the phone, because they went with plastic instead of metal, and I was thinking, you know, that might be a point where it could break. But at least 4 months later, the frame looks as good as new. Oh, actually, I am just seeing one there now. But yeah, you have to really look at the frame to be able to see them. And it having a built-in fingerprint scanner is also a nice touch too. It's not exactly that much more faster. In fact, it's often slower than having a physical, dedicated fingerprint scanner on the back, for example. It's the same sort of thing as with the physical keyboard. You don't need the keyboard all the time, so it is nice that it kind of gets out of the way when you don't need it, and pops up when you do need it. And in terms of, latency or anything like that, I haven't really had any times where I've wanted the fingerprint scanner and it hasn't showed up. There have been times where I put my finger on it and it hasn't worked, but that's very much in the minority. For the most part, it works, and it works really fast. But something that I was skeptical about at the beginning, that I am still skeptical about now, and in fact I just don't think is a good idea, are the macro and the depth camera. Those two cameras absolutely just aren't necessary on this phone. I mean, I've tried taking pictures while I've been covering the depth camera. The pictures have been taken totally fine, and it was able to focus totally fine. There are also phones that don't have that depth camera, and they focus totally fine too. In terms of how easy it is to actually capture a photo, this camera obviously is going to be a lot better than the OnePlus 3T that I used to have, but I don't think it's quite as good as the iPhone cameras or the Samsung cameras or any of those other cameras or the Pixel cameras, which are basically the top tier cameras out there. This camera though is passable, and for me, I don't really take too many pictures, so it doesn't bother me too much anyway. In terms of the macro camera, it does work, and the photos that it takes are passable. They're not bad photos really, but it just isn't necessary alongside the main camera. The main camera is, I think, 48 megapixels, and the macro camera is like 401. You can just zoom in on the main camera and basically get the same effect and also have more megapixels there in the final result. There just isn't a need for the macro camera at all. The wide angle camera though, on the other hand, I have used quite a lot, and it's a pretty good camera. It's not as good as the main one, but it does help in those scenarios where you're close up to something and you want to take a photo that's wider. I think it's a camera that pretty much all phones should have nowadays. It is really, really handy. So I'm really happy that that's in there. And the front cameras are okay too. I barely take selfies, so I don't really get to use them that much. But I wouldn't recommend using the wide angle camera to take a selfie of yourself because it just stretches you out. So yeah, in terms of cameras, I'm fine with all of them, basically other than the depth camera and the macro camera, which I think aren't necessary, and that money could have been put elsewhere. I did a whole kind of speech about that in my previous video about this phone, so you can look at that if you want to see, why I think they put the cameras in the first place. But yeah, anyway, at this point I'm going to move on. As for videos, They're actually really stable and they do look pretty good. I was really impressed with the video quality from this camera. The front facing camera is really good too. It does stabilize that too, and that actually does look pretty good. Overall, in terms of video, I don't really have any issues with it. I'm really happy with it. And I'm also really happy with the specs of this phone too. So this phone comes with a Snapdragon 765G, as well as 8GB of RAM. And for those specs, you get a phone that is really snappy, a phone that hasn't slowed down on me in the 4 months that I've used it, although I do imagine after a year or so it will start to slow down a bit. And on top of that, the battery life is really great too. It has a battery capacity of around 4,100, and that battery life, at least 4 months later, is easily going to get you through the full day. I barely have to charge this phone during the day. But when you do have to charge it, do bear in mind that this doesn't have wireless charging. I know some people are bothered about that, not me personally, but that is something to bear in mind. But when you do want to charge it up, and you want to charge it up by a wire, this phone has warp charging, which is basically technology built upon their dash charging, which is just basically a fancy word for fast charging, but faster than the usual fast charging. It does actually charge up really fast. It can get from around 0 to 100% in close to an hour. It is actually really impressive. I know that I can plug it in, go off and do something for, you know, a couple of minutes or half an hour or so, not a couple of minutes. And when I get back, it will have more than enough charge to last me for the rest of the day. And inside here is also 5G too. I personally haven't really used 5G. As with wireless charging, I just personally don't really care about it. 4G is more than fast enough for what I need it for. I can't personally speak for it, but if that is something that you're bothered about, I'd recommend just checking out the various other videos on YouTube about that, but I personally haven't tested it out. But the reason why I do really like this phone though is that I feel like it's a phone that offers a lot for the money that you spend. It's basically a phone that I feel is really good value for money. With phones like this being out there, I just can't really justify going for phones such as even the regular OnePlus 8T. It just seems like it's kind of overpriced compared to this phone for the experience that you have with it. I don't feel with this phone that I'm really missing out on anything. Yes, there isn't wireless charging and things like that, but I feel like all the things that are missing from this phone are things, to me at least, that don't really matter too much, and I certainly am not missing. For people like that, I think this phone is going to be pretty great, and I don't think you're going to be disappointed at all. The only time I think I would really consider going for a more expensive phone is if I go with the iPhone, but that's a whole different video in of itself. But what are your thoughts? I'd love to hear what you think about this phone and basically this price bracket down in the comment section down below. And yeah, that's it for this video anyway. I hope you'll stay safe out there, I hope you'll have a great day, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.